Hey, you doing everybody, and welcome to 8bits in the basement. So why are you filming at such a strange angle, Peter, you may ask? Well, the reason is I want to be able to show you much better my Commodore VIC-20 that I picked up. Now this is an example of the very computer that I got, the very first computer I ever had in the house back in 1987 for Christmas. It was second-hand when I got it, but it was all we could afford. And I spent many weeks playing away with it, learning a little bit of programming, and also playing a couple of the games that I got with it. And well, eventually it kind of gave up on me due to a faulty TV modulator. But here I am with another one in front of me. So I managed to pick this guy up in Spain from eBay. Now, it is a cost-reduced version of the Commodore VIC-20, so it's one of the newer versions of it, and it shares the same power port as the Commodore 64 did. Now, that also means that it shares this, which also came with it, one of these Commodore 64 or Commodore VIC-20 power bricks that are infamous for blown up Commodore 64s and VIC-20s, because it contains within it a 7805 voltage regulator, and when they fail, which they do, instead of sending out 5 volts to the computer, they send out up to 9 volts, which will fry every chip on the inside of it and render the computer pretty much landfill. Now, on top of that, I also got 3 cassettes with it, so full of games, all in Spanish as well. I also got, 5 cartridges with it. I got Seawolf, Sargon 2 Chess, The Sky is Falling, Mole Attack, and Radar Rat Race. I have plenty to keep me occupied there over the next while. Also, what came with it was this SCART cable from Retro Computer Shack, so it's compatible with both the Commodore 64 and with the Commodore VIC-20. And as it came from Spain, I also got the VIC-20 user guide in Spanish. And what I found quite interesting on the inside of it is, you'll see, now I don't know why this was put in, because it is a Commodore 64 guarantee slip, but it proves something I always said back in the day. The Commodore 64 was bought in a place in Spain called Baby Toys, which proves that the Commodore 64 is but a toy for children, whereas the Commodore VIC-20 is a true business machine for adults. At least that's what I maintained back in 1987 when everybody was laughing at me for having a VIC-20. But all that aside, the system isn't without its problems. The vendor said that there was a problem with it in that the F1 key isn't working. So what we'll do is we'll pretty much straight away power it up and see what it does, if it's even working. And yeah, we'll take it from there, see if we can repair whatever's wrong with it, and maybe play a few of these games and see what it can do. So we'll get to that right now. I've got my VIC-20, and here we are ready to power it up, and I'll show you what it does electronically. So what I've done is I've connected it to the TV using the Retro Computer Shack SCART cable that was provided. So that will give us a composite picture on screen. Now, I wasn't brave enough to attempt powering it up with the power supply that I was given with it, although that power supply does check out fairly okay with a multimeter, but I prefer to use this guy here. It's one that I bought for my Commodore 64, and luckily it's compatible with the old VIC-20, and there's no fear of that blowing up any computer you plug into it. So yeah, without any more speaking or whatever, we'll flick this power switch. Little power leg comes on, and we've got a picture on screen. So it's exactly the picture that we want to see. The colors are correct, and also it's reporting the correct amount of bytes free. We've got 3,583. So the system on power up is working well. Now, there are 1 or 2 little problems with it that don't actually show up on camera. There's a lot of jail bars, and there's also a kind of a funny zigzag pattern on each side of the border here, made up of pixels, which I don't believe should be there. One other little thing is that there's ghosting around all the characters here. So I don't know, maybe that is something that happens when you use one of these with an LCD TV and not a CRT one. The keyboard, it seems to be very dirty. There's keys on it that work fine. Other ones you need to really insist to get them to work. Other keys like the space bar don't work at all, nor do the cursor keys. The return key only works once in a blue moon, and the F1 key doesn't work at all either. Now, the F1 key is a little bit of a problem because any of these cartridge games that I got When you plug them in and power on, they all seem to be working fine, but the first thing you're presented with is press F1 to start the game. But F1 doesn't work, so I can't actually do anything with it as it stands. So I think the very first thing we'll do is we'll take it apart and we'll give the keyboard a thoroughly good clean and see if that repairs it. Okay, so let's get to opening up our old VIC-20. So the thing about it is what the Commodore 64 was modeled upon. So it actually opens in exactly the same way. When you flip it over, there's 3 screws that are holding it together, and all you've got to do is undo those. Now, the other thing that's lovely about these is that the keyboards between the Commodore VIC-20 and Commodore 64 are actually interchangeable, which is a very, very handy thing to know if you're trying to diagnose a fault in one or the other and you have both types of computer. Okay, so once you've removed those 3 screws, flip the VIC-20 back around again, and you'll find that you can open it just like a book. But you want to be careful because this plastic is quite brittle now, and there's 3 tabs at the back that risk breaking if you're anyway kind of rough with them. So the first thing I was presented with was a little bit of kind of moldy looking shielding, which I intend to get rid of. But what you want to do to separate the top part from the bottom part is there's a keyboard connector, which should just pull out, although in my case it was a little stiff. And there's also the leg connector that's situated on the right hand side of the board just under the shielding. Give that little pull out as well, and that should let you separate the 2. Looking at the keyboard part, you'll notice that it's held in place with 8 screws. So it's just holding the keyboard into the top plastics. You remove those 8 screws and you'll be able to remove the keyboard from the top plastics, and then you'll be able to work on it a lot more easily. Now, so that's the keyboard separated from the plastics. But now what we want to do is we want to separate the PCB from the keyboard. And they've used 20 odd screws in order to keep the 2 of those together. So I used a PH00 screwdriver to remove all those screws. Now, once those screws are removed, we're not quite finished just yet, because there's also the caps lock key, which is actually soldered in place with 2 little pieces of wire. So you're going to need to heat up your soldering iron, and you're going to have to apply a little hot solder just to pull out those little wires with your fingers, being careful not to burn your fingers. And once that's been done, you can just point the wire up the way, and you should be able to snap the PCB from the keyboard assembly. Okay, so I was very surprised once I got these 2 apart, because actually it looks immaculately clean on the inside. But I decided to give it a clean anyway, because I could probably do with it. So I used a little bit of alcohol on a Q-tip, as you call them in the Americas, or on a cotton bud, as we call them in Ireland. And I gave it, well, a good once over on all the little pads. Then I turned my attention to the little keyboard. Now, the keys themselves, each one of them on the bottom, have 2 little rubber type pads. I just folded a regular piece of paper, and pushing up each key, I just gave the little rubber pads on the back a slight little rub 10 or 12 times each, just to take off any little bit of residue that might have been on it. You can see the residue actually come off on the paper, but again, like I said, they didn't seem to be all that dirty. So once I had all that done, I decided I'd put it all back together and see if it made a difference. Okay, so keyboard cleaned, computer put back together, plugged into the TV, turned on, and still working. So that's always a bonus. I haven't broken anything. Now, one thing I will say about this is that the previous owner took very good care of the VIC-20 there. There was no dust on the inside of the case. There was no real dust on the keyboard itself either. It was all quite clean. To the point that when I opened it up and I was cleaning on the inside, I only got a small amount of dirt off the pads under the keys. The pads on the PCB itself were immaculately clean. So I was kind of afraid that maybe dirt wasn't the problem here. Maybe it was something much deeper inside in the VIC electronically that was causing the keyboard failures that I was seeing, more or less. However, it proves that it's always a good idea to give it a good cleaning before you go any further, because now what you'll see is every time I press on a key, the character comes up on screen, no problem at all. Spacebar that wasn't working before is now working with the slightest touch, as are the cursor keys. And the F1 key makes the cursor flash when I press it. So that's a good sign too. But what we'll do is the real acid test for that is I'm going to stick in Radar Rat Race, because we need to press F1 on most of these cartridge games to get the game to start. So I couldn't play any of these before. Now the other thing you'll notice is that this game is a PAL conversion of an NTSC game. So we get a slightly smaller screen and it's pushed to the top and the left. Now we can position that screen using the cursor keys. I couldn't do that before because my cursor keys weren't working. We need to press F1 to start the game. Again, I couldn't do that before because my F1 key wasn't working. And we see now that it's playing music and the picture is on screen. So we've got a working keyboard, and also it shows that the VIC is working quite well too. Now, I think the next thing we'll do is we'll open it back up. We'll have a little look at some of the chips, just get an idea of the geography of the inside of the system. And what we'll do is we'll future-proof it a bit. There's only a couple of capacitors on it. We'll change those out for newer ones. And what we'll do as well is we'll put a couple of heat sinks on top of some of the chips that run kind of hot. And we'll see where we take it from there. So we'll get to that straight away. This here is the VIC-20 motherboard after being taken out of the case. I've taken this little cover off this little box here in order to be able to change out the few bits and pieces I need inside. So starting from the right hand side over here, we've got the 6502 processor, the brains of the whole operation, the guy who runs the show. And in this PAL model, it's running at 1.1 megahertz. Here we've got two ROM chips. We've got the basic and the kernel ROM. And over here we have the character ROM. Up here we've got two VIAs. They're called the versatile interface adapters for the VIC. So they handle I/O, input-output operations, for the keyboard, for the cassette, for the joystick, for diskette, and really any input-output operations that need to be done for the VIC to communicate with the external world. Down below these, we've got two kilobyte memory chips, and that gives us 4 kilobytes of RAM. And across here we've got 3 1/2 kilobyte static RAM chips, so that gives us 1.5 kilobytes of RAM. So we've got 5.5K not available to the user. We've got about 4K available to the user, but we've got 5.5K on board. The one other chip of interest here is the little VIC chip inside in this little box here to keep it nice and toasty and warm, which isn't really a great idea. But this guy here is running the sound and the video on this system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change out these electrolytic capacitors. There's only 6 of them, so they're going to be changed out for newer ones. And I'm also going to try removing this box here so that this guy isn't like burning inside in an oven anymore, and we'll put a heatsink on top of it as well. And that's pretty much the kind of future proofing that I'm going to be doing on this today. So without talking too much more about it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat up my soldering iron and my little desoldering pump, and we'll get to doing all that. Okay, so the recapping on this little fella went quite well actually. The only thing of interest really is that I couldn't find any axial capacitors to replace the big one in the bottom right hand corner. So what I had to do was get a radial capacitor instead. And the problem with that is that the radial one will stand proud, whereas the axial one lies down kind of flat. And I was afraid that the case of the VIC-20 wouldn't close back properly again afterwards. But luckily, there seems to be a couple of millimeters clearance in there once it's done, and everything is closing up just fine. There's a lot of chips on the VIC-20 that need to be protected from heat. However, the hottest one is the VIC chip, and as I only had 2 heat sinks available to me, I decided that was the one that I would put those heat sinks on for the moment. So I used the double-sided thermal tape that I have in stock. Now it's only 5 millimeters wide, so I had to use 3 strips of it in order to cover the entire chip. Once I had stuck the tape down neatly onto the chip, I used a scalpel just to pick off the protective layer on the other side of the tape, and once that was off, I pressed the 2 heat sinks I had firmly to the center of the chip. Then I used the scalpel and a tweezers just to remove the excess on either side, and finally I tested that it was well pressed down and held in place by lifting the entire motherboard, holding just the heat sinks to lift it. I've got the old VIC-20. She's back up, she's back running. It's after being recapped. It's after being partially future-proofed. I say partially future-proofed because I only had enough heat sinks to go on the VIC chip. I've ordered more, and when they come I'll be putting them on the 2 VIA chips, on the 3 ROM chips, and also on the processor itself. I've also oosted this little cover for the video circuitry box. It's only there to stop emissions, and to be honest with you, it doesn't really do a whole lot. I had wanted to get rid of the walls off that box as well, but it proved to be a little bit too much of a job for my little solder sucker pump, and I couldn't do that without damaging the board. So I've decided to leave it in there. It's not doing it any harm. Apart from that, the recapping went very well, but it hasn't actually resolved the problems I was seeing on screen. I've still got some ghosting around the characters on screen. I've still got jail bars everywhere, and I've also got these kind of funny zigzag patterns down each side of the screen. But to be honest with you, it really doesn't bother me too much. It's much better than the reception or the signal I had on my VIC-20 back in the day. So yeah, I suppose I could always make up some kind of an S-video mod or something for to do that, but I'm not too concerned about it, like I say. Now, there's still plenty I can do on this. We can try it out with the old 1541 disk drive as well and all that kind of stuff, but that'll be for another episode, I think. What I was thinking was to wrap up on this episode. What we will do is we'll have an old game of The Sky is Falling on cartridge to see that everything is working fairly okay. So this guy here is played with a paddle, not with a joystick, and I've got a pair of paddles that I made up for my Atari 2600, so we'll try them with that. So just give me a second to plug all that in, and we'll have an old game of The Sky is Falling and see what it's like. Okay, so I'm after getting myself set up here. I've got my 2 paddles in, and I've got my cartridge. So we power the system on, we get a picture on screen, we can center it more or less with the cursor keys, and I press F1 and F1 again for a 1-player game. So we can check at this point, and we see that our paddles are working, so that's good anyway. Now there is a little bit of jitter on it, but that's because I built these for an Atari 2600, so the value of the potentiometer inside is different than what a VIC-20 or Commodore 64 would usually have. But that doesn't matter, we should still be able to play the game anyway. Now, so this game here is called The Sky is Falling, and it's a little bit, well, it's not like Arkanoid at all, in fact. All you're doing is you're kind of catching these kind of apple-type fireball-y things that are falling from the sky. Now, as I say, it was called The Sky is Falling on the Commodore VIC-20. It came out on a number of other systems too, and on the color computer it was known as Popcorn. But the premise is still the same. You're trying to catch these things in your basket that are falling from above, and you don't want to let any of them hit the ground or you lose a life. You got 3 lives. You're trying to rack up points. It gets harder as it goes on. There's 6 little lines of balls on top of the screen. They go from large to small. So you've got 2 really large ones, 2 medium, and 2 really small. And as you work up through the ranks, the number of little bats you have in your little thingy here on the bottom go from 3 down to 1. So I'm pretty much right down to my last life now. And that's game over for me, I think. Yeah, there we go. So I got 2,600 points. You can play 2-player as well, and if you're playing 2-player, you're playing against the other guy to try and get the most points, and that's pretty much it. As it is it for this particular episode. So in the future, like I said before, I will be connecting this guy up to the old 1541 disk drive, and we'll see what we can do with that. Also, what I'd like to do is, I know that there's the Penultimate Plus cartridge available, and it has all kinds of games and all kinds of memory expansions, but what I would like to try doing myself is to build a little internal memory expansion for it that can be turned on or turned off, and you know, with a little switch, so to have a kind of that you can use it this way, or you can use the expansion with the disk drive if needed, that kind of a way, and maybe make up a multi-cart like I usually do with nearly every other system I've had that takes cartridges. So yeah, if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't done so already, click the old subscribe button. Otherwise, I'd really appreciate an old thumbs up and leave a comment down below. So there you go. Thanks to absolutely everybody who's watched up to this point. Thanks for supporting the channel, and I hope to talk to you all again very, very soon down here in the basement. So until then, PD will be waiting for you. We talk to you all again very, very soon. Bye bye.